Chapter 8 of Against the Grain. This recording is in the public domain. Martin Geeson. Against the Grain by Joris, Karl, Huysmans. Translated by John Howard. Chapter 8. He had always been passionately fond of flowers, but during his residence at Jutigny, that love had been lavished upon flowers of all sorts. He had never cultivated distinctions and discriminations in regard to them. Now his taste in this direction had grown refined and self-conscious. For a long time he had scorned the popular plants which grow in flat baskets, in watered pots, under green awnings, or under the red parasols of Parisian markets. Simultaneous with the refinement of his literary taste and his preoccupations with art, which permitted him to be content only in the presence of choice creations, distilled by subtly troubled brains, and simultaneous with the weariness he began to feel in the presence of popular ideas, his love for flowers had grown purged of all impurities and lees, and had become clarified. He compared a florist's shop to a microcosm wherein all the categories of society are represented. Here are poor common flowers, the kind found in hovels, which are truly at home only when resting on ledges of garret windows, their roots thrust into milk bottles and old pans, like the gillyflower, for example. And one also finds stupid and pretentious flowers like the rose, which belongs in the porcelain flower pots painted by young girls. Then there are the flowers of noble lineage like the orchid, so delicate and charming, at once cold and palpitating, exotic flowers exiled in the heated glass palaces of Paris, princesses of the vegetable kingdom living in solitude, having absolutely nothing in common with the street plants and other bourgeois flora. He permitted himself to feel a certain interest and pity only for the popular flowers enfeebled by their nearness to the odours of sinks and drains in the poor quarters. In revenge, he detested the bouquets harmonizing with the cream and gold rooms of pretentious houses. For the joy of his eyes, he reserved those distinguished rare blooms which had been brought from distant lands, and whose lives were sustained by artful devices under artificial equators. But this very choice, this predilection for the conservatory plants, had itself changed under the influence of his mode of thought. Formerly, during his Parisian days, his love for artificiality had led him to abandon real flowers and to use in their place replicas faithfully executed by means of the miracles performed with india rubber and wire, calico and taffeta, paper and silk. He was the possessor of a marvelous collection of tropical plants, the result of the labors of skillful artists who knew how to follow nature and recreate her step by step, taking the flower as a bud, leading it to its full development, even imitating its decline, reaching such a point of perfection as to convey every nuance, the most fugitive expressions of the flower when it opens at dawn and closes at evening, observing the appearance of the petals curled by the wind or rumpled by the rain, applying dewdrops of gum on its matutinal corollas, shaping it in full bloom, when the branches bend under the burden of their sap, or showing the dried stem and shrivelled cupules, when calyxes are thrown off and leaves fall to the ground. This wonderful art had held him entranced for a long while, but now he was dreaming of another experiment. He wished to go one step beyond. Instead of artificial flowers imitating real flowers, natural flowers should mimic the artificial ones. He directed his ideas to this end, and had not to seek long or go far, since his house lay in the very heart of a famous horticultural region. He visited the conservatories of the Avenue de Chatillon and of the Aunay Valley, and returned exhausted, his purse empty, astonished at the strange forms of vegetation he had seen, thinking of nothing but the species he had acquired, and continually haunted by memories of magnificent and fantastic plants. The flowers came several days later. Des Esseintes, holding a list in his hands, verified each one of his purchases. The gardeners from their wagons brought a collection of caladiums, which sustained enormous heart-shaped leaves on turgid, hairy stalks. While preserving an air of relationship with its neighbour, no one leaf repeated the same pattern. Others were equally extraordinary. The roses, like the virginale, seemed cut out of varnished cloth or oil silks. The white ones, like the albano, appeared to have been cut out of an ox's transparent pleura, or the diaphanous bladder of a pig. Some, particularly the Madame Mame, imitated zinc and parodied pieces of stamped metal having a hue of emperor green, stained by drops of oil paint and by spots of white and red lead. Others, like the Bosphorus, gave the illusion of a starched calico in crimson and myrtle green. Still others, like the Aurora Borealis, displayed leaves having the color of raw meat, streaked with purple sides, violet fibrils, tumefied leaves from which oozed blue wine and blood. The albano and the aurora sounded the two extreme notes of temperament, the apoplexy and chlorosis of this plant. The gardeners brought still other varieties which had the appearance of artificial skin ridged with false veins, and most of them looked as though consumed by syphilis and leprosy, for they exhibited livid surfaces of flesh veined with scarlet rash and damasked with eruptions. Some had the deep red hue of scars that have just closed, or the dark tint of incipient scabs. Others were marked with matter raised by scaldings. There were forms which exhibited shaggy skins hollowed by ulcers and relieved by cankers, and a few appeared embossed with wounds, covered with black mercurial hog lard, with green unguents of belladonna smeared with grains of dust and the yellow micas of iodoform. Collected in his home, these flowers seemed to Des Esseintes more monstrous than when he had beheld them confused with others among the glass rooms of the conservatory. "Sapristi!" he exclaimed enthusiastically. A new plant, modelled like the caladiums, the Alocasia metallica, excited him even more. It was coated with a layer of bronze green on which glanced silver reflections. It was the masterpiece of artificiality. It could be called a piece of stovepipe cut by a chimney maker into the form of a pike head. The men next brought clusters of leaves, lozenge-like in shape and bottle green in color. In the centre rose a rod at whose end a varnished ace of hearts swayed. As though meaning to defy all conceivable forms of plants, a fleshy stalk climbed through the heart of this intense vermilion ace, a stalk that in some specimens was straight, in others showed ringlets like a pig's tail. It was the anthurium, an aroid recently imported into France from Colombia, a variety of that family to which also belonged an amorphophallus, a Cochin China plant with leaves shaped like fish knives, with long dark stems seamed with gashes, like lambs flecked with black. Des Esseintes exulted. They brought a new batch of monstrosities from the wagon, echinopses, issuing from padded compresses with rose-coloured flowers that looked like the pitiful stumps, gaping nidularia revealing skinless foundations in steel plates, Tillandsia lindeni, the colour of wine must, with jagged scrapers, Cypripedia, with complicated contours, a crazy piece of work, seemingly designed by a crazy inventor. They looked like sabots, or like a lady's work table on which lies a human tongue with taut filaments, such as one sees designed on the illustrated pages of works treating of the diseases of the throat and mouth. Two little side pieces of a red jujube colour, which appeared to have been borrowed from a child's toy mill, completed this singular collection of a tongue's underside, with the colour of slate and wine lees, and of a glossy pocket from whose lining oozed a viscous glue. He could not remove his eyes from this unnatural orchid, which had been brought from India. Then the gardeners, impatient at his procrastinations, themselves began to read the labels fastened to the pots they were carrying in. Bewildered, Des Esseintes looked on and listened to the cacophonous sounds of the names. The Encephalatus horridus, a gigantic iron rust-coloured artichoke, like those put on portals of chateaux to foil wall climbers. The Cocos micania, a sort of notched and slender palm, surrounded by tall leaves resembling paddles and oars. The Zamia lemani, an immense pineapple, a wondrous Chester leaf, planted in sweet heather soil, its top bristling with barbed javelins and jagged arrows. The Cibotium spectabile, surpassing the others by the craziness of its structure, hurling a defiance to reverie, as it darted through the palmated foliage an enormous orang-outang tail, a hairy dark tail whose end was twisted into the shape of a bishop's cross. But he gave little heed, for he was impatiently awaiting the series of plants which most bewitched him: the vegetable ghouls, the carnivorous plants, the Antilles flytrap, with its shaggy border secreting a digestive liquid, armed with crooked prickles coiling around each other, forming a grating about the imprisoned insect. The Drosera of the peat bogs, provided with glandular hair. The Saracena and the Cephalothus, opening greedy horns capable of digesting and absorbing real meat. Lastly, the Nepenthes, whose capricious appearance transcends all limits of eccentric forms. He never wearied of turning in his hands the pot in which this floral extravagance stirred. It imitated the gum tree, whose long leaf of dark metallic green it possessed, but it differed in that a green string hung from the end of its leaf, an umbilic cord supporting a greenish urn, streaked with jasper, a sort of German porcelain pipe, a strange bird's nest which tranquilly swung about, revealing an interior covered with hair. "This is really something worth while," Des Esseintes murmured. He was forced to tear himself away, for the gardeners, anxious to leave, were emptying their wagons of their contents and depositing, without any semblance of order, the tuberous begonias and black crotons stained like sheet iron with saturn red. Then he perceived that one name still remained on his list. It was the Cattleya of New Granada. On it was designed a little winged bell of a faded lilac, an almost dead mauve. He approached, placed his nose above the plant, and quickly recoiled. It exhaled an odor of toy boxes of painted pine. It recalled the horrors of a New Year's Day. He felt that he would do well to mistrust it, and he almost regretted having admitted, among the scentless plants, this orchid which evoked the most disagreeable memories. As soon as he was alone, his gaze took in this vegetable tide which foamed in the vestibule. Intermingled with each other, they crossed their swords, their krisses and stanchions, taking on a resemblance to a green pile of arms, above which, like barbaric pennons, floated flowers with hard, dazzling colours. The air of the room grew rarefied. Then, in the shadowy dimness of a corner, near the floor, a white, soft light crept. He approached, and perceived that the phenomenon came from the rhizomorphes, which threw out these night lamp gleams while respiring. "These plants are amazing," he reflected. Then he drew back to let his eye encompass the whole collection at a glance. His purpose was achieved. Not one single specimen seemed real. The cloth, paper, porcelain and metal seemed to have been loaned by man to nature to enable her to create her monstrosities. When unable to imitate man's handiwork, nature had been reduced to copying the inner membranes of animals, to borrowing the vivid tints of their rotting flesh, their magnificent corruptions. "All is syphilis," thought Des Esseintes, his eye riveted upon the horrible streaked stainings of the caladium plants, caressed by a ray of light. And he beheld a sudden vision of humanity consumed through the centuries by the virus of this disease. Since the world's beginnings, every single creature had, from sire to son, transmitted the imperishable heritage, the eternal malady which has ravaged man's ancestors, and whose effects are visible even in the bones of old fossils that have been exhumed. The disease had swept on through the centuries, gaining momentum. It even raged today, concealed in obscure sufferings, dissimulated under symptoms of headaches and bronchitis, hysterics and gout. It crept to the surface from time to time, preferably attacking the ill-nourished and the poverty-stricken, spotting faces with gold pieces, ironically decorating the faces of poor wretches, stamping the mark of money on their skins to aggravate their unhappiness. and here, on the coloured leaves of the plants, it was resurgent in its original splendour. It is true, pursued Des Esseintes, returning to the course of reasoning he had momentarily abandoned, it is true that most often nature, left alone, is incapable of begetting such perverse and sickly specimens. She furnishes the original substance, the germ and the earth, the nourishing womb and the elements of the plant, which man then sets up, models, paints and sculpts as he wills. Limited, stubborn and formless though she be, nature has at last been subjected, and her master has succeeded in changing, through chemical reaction, the earth's substances, in using combinations which had been long matured, cross-fertilization processes long prepared, in making use of slips and graftings, and man now forces differently coloured flowers in the same species, invests new tones for her, modifies to his will the long-standing form of her plants, polishes the rough clods, puts an end to the period of botch-work, places his stamp on them, imposes on them the mark of his own unique art. It cannot be gainsaid, he thought, resuming his reflections, that man in several years is able to effect a selection which slothful nature can produce only after centuries. Decidedly, the horticulturalists are the real artists nowadays. He was a little tired, and he felt stifled in this atmosphere of crowded plants. The promenades he had taken during the last few days had exhausted him. The transition had been too sudden from the tepid atmosphere of his room to the out of doors, from the placid tranquillity of a reclusive life to an active one. He left the vestibule and stretched out on his bed to rest. But, absorbed by this new fancy of his mind, even in his sleep, could not lessen its tension, and he was soon wandering among the gloomy insanities of a nightmare. He found himself in the centre of a walk, in the heart of the wood. Twilight had fallen. He was strolling by the side of a woman, whom he had never seen before. She was emaciated and had flaxen hair, a bulldog face, freckles on her cheeks, crooked teeth projecting under a flat nose. She wore a nurse's white apron, a long neckerchief torn in strips on her bosom, half shoes like those worn by Prussian soldiers, and a black bonnet adorned with frillings and trimmed with a rosette. There was a foreign look about her, like that of a mountebank at a fair. He asked himself who the woman could be. He felt that she had long been an intimate part of his life. Vainly he sought her origin, her name, her profession, her reason for being. No recollection of this liaison, which was inexplicable and yet positive, rewarded him. He was searching his past for a clue, when a strange figure suddenly appeared on horseback before them, trotting about for a moment and then turning around in its saddle. Des Esseintes' heart almost stopped beating, and he stood riveted to the spot with horror. He nearly fainted. This enigmatic, sexless figure was green. Through her violet eyelids the eyes were terrible in their cold blue. Pimples surrounded her mouth. Horribly emaciated skeleton arms, bared to the elbows, issued from ragged, tattered sleeves and trembled feverishly, and the skinny legs shivered in shoes that were several sizes too large. The ghastly eyes were fixed on Des Esseintes, penetrating him, freezing his very marrow. Wilder than ever, the bulldog woman threw herself at him and commenced to howl like a dog at the killing, her head hanging on her rigid neck. Suddenly he understood the meaning of the frightful vision. Before him was the image of syphilis. Pursued by fear and quite beside himself, he sped down a pathway at top speed and gained a pavilion standing among the laburnums to the left, where he fell into a chair in the passageway. After a few moments, when he was beginning to recover his breath, the sound of sobbing made him lift his head. The bulldog woman was in front of him, and grotesque and woeful, while warm tears fell from her eyes, she told him that she had lost her teeth in her flight. As she spoke, she drew clay pipes from the pocket of her nurse's apron, breaking them and shoving pieces of the stems into the hollows of her gums. But she is really absurd, Des Esseintes told himself. These stems will never stick. And as a matter of fact, they dropped out one after another. At this moment were heard the galloping sounds of an approaching horse. A fearful terror pierced Des Esseintes. His limbs gave way. The galloping grew louder. Despair brought him sharply to his senses. He threw himself upon the woman who was stamping on the pipe bowls, entreating her to be silent, not to give notice of their presence by the sound of her shoes. She writhed and struggled in his grip. He led her to the end of the corridor, strangling her to prevent her crying out. Suddenly he noticed the door of a coffee house with green Venetian shutters. It was unlocked. He pushed it, rushed in headlong, and then paused. Before him, in the center of a vast glade, huge white pierrots were leaping, rabbit-like, under the rays of the moon. Tears of discouragement welled to his eyes. Never, no, never would he succeed in crossing the threshold. I shall be crushed, he thought. And as though to justify his fears, the ranks of tall pierrots swarmed and multiplied. Their somersaults now covered the entire horizon, the whole sky, on which they landed now on their heads, now on their feet. Then the hoof-beats paused. He was in the passage behind a round skylight. More dead than alive, Des Esseintes turned about, and through the round window beheld projecting erect ears, yellow teeth, nostrils from which breathed two jets of vapour smelling of phenol. He sank to the ground, renouncing all ideas of flight or resistance. He closed his eyes so as not to behold the horrible gaze of syphilis, which penetrated through the wall, which even pierced his closed lids, which he felt gliding over his moist spine, over his body, whose hair bristled in pools of cold sweat. He waited for the worst, and even hoped for the coup de grace to end everything. A moment which seemed to last a century passed. Shuddering, he opened his eyes. Everything had vanished. Without any transition, as though by some stage device, a frightful mineral landscape receded into the distance, a wan, dead, waste, gullied landscape. A light illumined this desolate sight, a peaceful white light that recalled gleams of phosphorus dissolved in oil. Something that stirred on the ground became a deathly pale, nude woman whose feet were covered with green silk stockings. He contemplated her with curiosity. As though frizzed by overheated irons, her hair curled, becoming straight again at the end. Her distended nostrils were the colour of roast veal. Her eyes were desirous, and she called to him in low tones. He had no time to answer, for already the woman was changing. Flamboyant colours passed and repassed in her eyes. Her lips were stained with a furious anthurium red. The nipples of her breasts flashed, painted like two pods of red pepper. A sudden intuition came to him. "It is the flower," he said. And his reasoning mania persisted in his nightmare. Then he observed the frightful irritation of the breasts and mouth, discovered spots of bister and copper on the skin of her body, and recoiled bewildered. But the woman's eyes fascinated him, and he advanced slowly, attempting to thrust his heels into the earth so as not to move, letting himself fall, and yet lifting himself to reach her. Just as he touched her, the dark amorphophalli leaped up from all sides and thrust their leaves into his abdomen, which rose and fell like a sea. He had broken all the plants, experiencing a limitless disgust in seeing these warm, firm stems stirring in his hands. Suddenly, the detested plants had disappeared, and two arms sought to enlace him. A terrible anguish made his heart beat furiously, for the eyes, the horrible eyes of the woman, had become a clear, cold and terrible blue. He made a superhuman effort to free himself from her embrace, but she held him with an irresistible movement. He beheld the wild nidularium which yawned, bleeding in steel plates. With his body he touched the hideous wound of this plant. He felt himself dying. Awoke with a start, suffocating, frozen, mad with fear, and sighing, "Oh, thank God, it was but a dream." End of chapter 8. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.